Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Yvonne Schwab, ACG Silicon Valley CEO. As many of you know already, ACGSV is the leading business-to-business networking organization in Silicon Valley, providing connections, thought leadership, and enabling personal and organizational growth. ACG Silicon Valley offers an array of networking opportunities with over 13,000 members in 59 chapters across the world. ACG provides local connections with a global reach. Now, our chapter is offering a variety of virtual events coming up in the next few months. We invite you to visit our website at acgsv.org to see the full calendar. Next Tuesday, we have an event on the future of work, how to leverage remote work trends to reduce operational costs. In a very busy October, we are also tackling the topic of compliance practitioners in the lead, creating and enhancing an effective ESG program. And very timely, in collaboration with the Silicon Valley Directors Exchange, an event on cryptocurrency and why it might be the competitive edge that future-proofs modern enterprises. And because we all need a little break here and there, especially with the pandemic lasting longer than we all thought, ACG Silicon Valley has their third virtual wine tasting next month, this time with the Pasalacqua, if I say that correctly, winery. Sign up soon to get your shipment on time. And last but not least, we have our first in-person event planned for October 27th, a happy hour at the Pullman Hotel in Redwood Shores. We'd love to see you all there. Now, we're excited to offer you today's event, which would not have been possible without our amazing sponsor, Dell Technologies, which is committed to transforming businesses, shaping the future of innovation, and developing technologies to drive human progress. Hopefully, you have your lunches in front of you, also courtesy of Dell Technologies. Thank you so very much. Now, we kindly ask you to please stay muted during the event unless you are asked otherwise. I would love to introduce you to our moderator today, Jim Shook. He is the Director of Cybersecurity and Compliance Practice of the Global Technology Office at Dell Technologies. Jim helps customers to better understand cybersecurity requirements and best practices, from regulatory and legal concerns to the technical details. He is focused mainly on ransomware and destructive attacks and combating their impact with cyber resilience capabilities and technologies. So now, without further ado, Jim.
Yvonne, thanks so much. And thanks to the ACG Silicon Valley for the opportunity to be here. I'm really privileged to moderate this panel. Some really great people, but not only that, a very broad variety of perspectives. So I'm really interested to get into this. We've got some good questions. Just quick housekeeping. We're going to structure this. We're going to have some introductions. We're going to do some structured kind of question and discussion. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat. We're going to monitor those. We may take some as we go. We may get them at the end, but we are going to reserve time at the end, and really interested to hear from all of you. So let me get our panel introduced first. I want to start with my friend Amanda Owens from Founders Federal Credit Union. Amanda?
Good afternoon. As he said, I'm Amanda Owens. I'm the VP of IT at Founders Federal Credit Union. I also manage the cybersecurity and IT services for FIT. FIT is a Founders Innovative Technology QSO. For those of you who don't know, a QSO is a credit union service organization that allows us to offer IT services not only to other credit unions, but also to any organization. I've been with the credit union now for 25 years. I would say the last 10 years has been focused on IT GRC, cybersecurity, and infrastructure. I'm excited about today's topic. Cyber resiliency, I think, should be a priority for everybody. It needs to be. Cyber resilience is evidence of a mature cybersecurity program. And really, we've got to be prepared. We can't get around that, because it's not a matter of if we're impacted by a cyber attack, it's just when. So being prepared is key to that. So I appreciate being a part of this panel today, and I think we'll have some great discussion. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Amanda. Bobby, let me go over to you.
Hi, thanks, Jim, and really nice to meet you too, Amanda. I'm Bobby Stumpley. I'm the Business Unit Security Officer at Dell Technologies, focused on the product groups. So I have responsibility for the breadth of security issues from personnel, physical, product and application, and cybersecurity in those product units. And it's a great opportunity to bring together a convergence of security problems and integrated solutions. And I think for me, what's really great about that is this topic of cyber resiliency, right? As we're in this data era where we're digitizing everything and moving to truly digital business operations, we really need to think about resiliency in an integrated way. So it's the next step in our business continuity thinking. It's very much a part of how we need to operate in this modern, connected, data-driven era. So it's a great panel today.
Thank you, Bobby. Tim, how about you?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Jim. My name is Tim Keeler. I'm the founder and CEO of Remediant. Before starting Remediant, I was actually, I spent quite a number of years as an incident response consultant, where I was helping quite a number of enterprises deal with various types of post-breach remediation. And that was really the key inspiration for starting the company. Really what we saw is at the center of every attack was, administrative credential theft. And we see this, with the breakdown of all the different breach reports. But really, our vision is to really help adopt some of these new principles, what we are talking in the industry. So zero trust, zero standing privilege. Where do administrative credentials and rights play a role in all that, and how are attackers exploiting that? So our vision is really, we should just make this as dead simple for companies. And what we have found is, really making sure you have good visibility and protection around this is really at the kind of the forefront of cyber resiliency, right? So we want to look at this, whether it's a insider, outsider, how administrative credentials are being exploited, and more importantly, making sure that you have the right controls in place to understand how to react in various situations.
Thanks, Tim. And our final panelist, Paul Lewis from Kalamu. Paul?
Thanks, Jim. So I'm Paul Lewis. I'm the founder and CEO of Kalamu, and we are a next generation data protection technology that allows data to actually automatically self-heal from a ransomware attack. And at Kalamu, we have a saying. We say that we don't try to prevent a ransomware attack from occurring. We just don't care if one does, because the data automatically self-heals and not from a backup. I've been in information security my entire career. And like Tim, I've been an incident responder. I've unfortunately been able to see cyber attacks all around the world in many different verticals and helped a lot of different recovery efforts. And look, the bottom line is this: cyber resiliency is a top priority to me because it affects all of us. We are all a victim. And we've made great progress, but the bad guys are getting smarter, and unfortunately, they continue to win. So we need to figure out how to eliminate, not just shrink, but eliminate the attack surface. And I look forward to some exciting dialogue today, and it's a great pleasure being here.
Thanks, Paul. So let me kick this off. And we've talked a little bit about our topic is cyber resiliency. There's lots of definitions out there. Let me read one from Nist. The ability to anticipate, withstand, recover from, and adapt to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks, or compromises on systems that use or are enabled by cyber resources. So that's quite a mouthful, big definition. It covers a lot of ground. Amanda, I want to start with you a little bit. We've all had a couple words on what cyber resiliency means to us, but how does it differ from cybersecurity itself?
I believe that cybersecurity, it's more focused around the ability to protect our systems and our data. And it's usually focused around the technical controls that are put in place, the implementing the layers of controls. And I think the difference with cyber resiliency, my light keeps going out, sorry. Cyber resiliency is the ability to respond and recover. I know here at the credit union, when we started looking at that, making cyber resiliency a priority back in 2017, we had the we were asked to assist with a ransomware attack. Thankfully, it wasn't in our environment. It was with an organization here near our community. And just seeing that we had a cybersecurity or cyber recovery vault in our budget for a couple of years. But after experiencing that and walking through that with that organization, we decided it had to be a priority. So we started focusing on cyber resiliency. Then one of the first things that we did was implement a cyber recovery vault in our environment. I think in cyber resilience, you've got to minimize the impact and make sure the integrity of your data is protected. And then kind of the ways that we approach that is making sure that our team was prepared, that our team was trained and ready for an event or an incident. So understanding our controls was important to us, minimizing the impact, developing a solid, making sure you have a solid incident response plan, and run books. We created very specific run books. So no matter who was here, who was responding to the event, it was going to be responded to consistent. That was important to us. And another thing is recovery testing, not just backup testing, but making sure you're testing your vault, making sure you're testing your incident response plan, you're testing your controls, all of those things is how we kind of focused our cyber resilience strategy. And because trying to figure it out during a test is much better than trying to figure it out during a live event.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the case. And I'm laughing a little bit here, Bobby. I know you're struggling to be resilient from dog barking, and so we can get into that a little bit. But I wanted to ask you, you've had great success in the public sector and the private sector. Do you differ kind of how you view or talk about cyber resilience if you're on one side of that table versus the other, or is it the same?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's the same, right? The thing I love about that Nist definition is that it really covers the people, the processes, and the technology. The anticipate is about thinking about and being prepared for threats that your business operations might be impacted by, which means you need to understand the data and the business processes that are important to you that you need to have in place. The withstand is about having meaningful security controls in place so that there are so that you're changing the attack surface for your adversary, right? The recover from is, okay, when it happens, how do you get back as quickly as possible? That means having the plans, having the technology, having the people in place, having the training in place. And then adapt means that you need to be a learning organization, right? You need to really think about what happened this time, whether it happened to you or happened to somebody else, how you can learn from that and how you can grow. And Amanda, I think your example was really pertinent to that point, right? You saw something happen in somebody else's place and made sure you had the technical controls in place in your organization. Those processes are true whether you're in a public sector organization or a private sector company. You might have a different set of regulatory controls you have to work within, and perhaps a different set of stakeholders or of transparency requirements, but the core needs as it relates to cyber resilience are the same. And I think it's incredibly important because it talks about, we talk about this in terms of things enabled by cyber resources. And I struggle in this modern era to think about what isn't enabled by cyber resources, right? So even though there are some dams in this country who are still, very manually switched, they're enabled by a set of analytics or processes in some way, right? Someone's looking at a computer for some part of the process, or there's some operational control system somewhere. And so this definition is important to all of us, and this level of preparation is important to all of us.
Agreed. Yeah. And Paul and Tim, you're a little more narrowly focused. You both had long careers in the area, so you've got a broad perspective on this. But from a, like an individual solution or technology standpoint, how do you view or talk about cyber resilience? And I'll flip this over a little bit to you, Paul, first, and then over to Tim.
So look, I think if we look at the Nist definition, the beginning part of the definition, anticipate, withstand, and recover from, I think we've done a lot around anticipate. We've made tons of progress there with threat detection and AI and monitoring and a whole bunch of great technologies. But withstand and recover from are still very ad hoc, in my opinion. And these are things that we desperately need to automate. And I think if we get that part right, it will be a turning point for cybersecurity.
Interesting. Tim?
And for me, I think, when we talk about cyber resiliency, you can definitely feel like this very nebulous area, right? And it's like, okay, where do I begin? Where do I start?
Right.
And in my view, it really comes down to the fundamentals of things, right? It's understanding what you're trying to protect, understanding your infrastructure, and really at the forefront of that is this concept of visibility, right? So when you take a look at what you need to protect and what you need to put into place, right? The best place to start is, well, let's take a look at how attackers are exploiting these environments, right? That gives you kind of the good foundation to get visibility. And if you don't have visibility in certain areas, like, understand you're not alone there, right? But you're not going to be able to put effective security controls in place if you don't understand, maybe, kind of digging deeper into the infrastructure. So making sure that you have good visibility across the board helps you understand and approach this from a risk-based perspective. It's like, okay, these are areas that I might not fully have, good security controls over. And I think if you have good visibility and that you're not going to have everything protected at all times, then like we talked about earlier, it's a matter of when something happens. It's not a matter of if, and you want to make sure that you are well prepared going into that. And that's, really for me, that's what cyber resiliency means.
So to the audience, bear with me, give me a little runway on this next question. Wanted to talk a little bit about what we talk about in the cybersecurity world as the CIA triad. And so that means it's really how we think about protecting data from different aspects. We protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of that data. So confidentiality can be triggered if somebody's accessing data that doesn't have the right. The integrity, if somebody's corrupting or modifying data, that's a bad thing. And the availability is triggered by somebody prohibiting you from accessing your systems, like a denial of service or a ransomware destructive attack. And of course, we've had so much about ransomware in the news lately. So those are three different aspects, but they all fall under the cybersecurity umbrella and under the larger umbrella of resilience. And Paul, I wanted to hit you up first with this question. When you think about those things, should people be treating them differently? Do you emphasize one over the other in a certain industry or risk tolerance? How do you talk about those different aspects?
So I think the problem here is that we're weighing each pillar independently. And I think we're looking for a solution to each when we really need a solution, I think, that covers all three simultaneously. And we continue to make progress by adding layers of defense, but the bad actor continues to get through, right? I mean, we make these advances and then it feels like, they're always a step ahead of us. So we need to look at data resilience differently. And I think we need to start with the premise, this is going to be hard to swallow, but I think we need to start with the premise that the bad actor is going to penetrate our defenses. We just need to come to the realization that that is a real truth, and that is where we need to start this process. So instead of focusing only on protecting the infrastructure and layering on more security, which is very important, we need to also focus on protecting the data, the actual ones and zeros, and not just the magnetic media or the solid state media that is holding the data, but the actual data itself. And I think we need to find a way to devalue the data to everyone except for the rightful owner. While keeping it confidential, right? We need to have proper integrity. We need to have availability across any medium, including cloud and multi-cloud. And I think we can accomplish this by following the DIE model, the distributed immutable ephemeral model. And there's several emerging companies. There's some really cool, really exciting technologies that are emerging right now in this space with a whole slew of companies. And I think by making data resilient and immutable, even if the data is placed in the public domain, is what we need to focus on. So I think we need to look at data resilience differently by addressing the problem holistically, not just the independent pillars of the CIA triad.
Any follow-up thoughts from our panel? Bobby, I know you had a couple thoughts on this in our pre-call.
Yeah, so Paul, I'm a huge fan of the DIE model there as well. I think that I think it's a false choice, right? The CIA presenting it as though there's one or the other that's more important is really a false choice. And which means that you've got to really think about it at a more scalable approach and more centrally. So really the focus on data is really the important part of how we're doing this. And then with that, it's extending that from focusing on data to focusing on the business process and the workload that data is supporting, and making sure that the protections that are in place and the resiliency thoughts that are in place are around both of those, so that we can most effectively apply the processes, the technology, and others to the places where it makes the most difference.
Mm.
That's a great point, Bobby, and something that we talk about a lot with customers. It's difficult sometimes, depending on who we're talking to identify the key systems, the key processes within a business. And, you know, IT sometimes struggles with that. And I think people who are involved from a business standpoint can really chip in and help quite a bit there. Let's talk a little bit about where to focus. So, you know, again, when we talk about cybersecurity generally with many of our customers, we'll start with the Nist cybersecurity framework. It's a good way to talk about different capabilities that fall into different buckets. If you're familiar with it at all, there's identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And Paul said something, you know, let's face the fact that the bad actors are going to get in. So some of the things that we do in cybersecurity, I think we need to continue to do. We need to keep out as many as we can. We need to detect and limit what they do. But it really brings up that idea of, okay, if we accept that they're going to get in occasionally, we need to recover. So Tim, kind of tipping over to you here, of those 5 and thinking about what Paul said, are we light in one area? Do we need to overfocus? Do we need to have that balanced scorecard? Kind of what's your perspective on that idea of a focus area?
Yeah, you know, I think the identify is the first and the foremost, because if you don't understand what you're trying to protect, well, then you're not going to be effective at protecting it. And, you know, in a lot of these scenarios, right, it's really kind of going in with the mindset and assuming something is going to be compromised. And then, you know, kind of you have to rest back on that and ask yourselves, okay, well, if you assume something is compromised, do you have the right security controls in place? One, to, you know, have visibility and understand, oh, something malicious is going on, because you definitely want to be the first to understand that. And then, you know, second, making sure that you have, you know, kind of the right security controls in place, you know, to make it harder or prevent, you know, something from happening. So if, you know, if you're kind of looking at this from an attacker's perspective, it's like, okay, well, once you're inside an environment, what do you have, you know, what do you have access to? And, you know, and that's kind of going back to Paul's, you know, point is like, you know, defense in depth is really important, but you really want to make sure that you're looking at this from, you know, the right risk profile. And different companies are going to have, you know, different views on what they're trying to protect, whether it's intellectual property, sometimes it's customer data, sometimes it's financial data, and really making sure that you have a good view of the business and understanding what you are trying to protect. You know, so a lot of my work actually was doing work in the pharmaceutical industry. And as I was talking to different members of the security team, asking them, what are they trying to protect? You know, kind of their view is like, oh, well, we have to protect the Active Directory environment, the domain controllers, right? Because that is the keys to the kingdom. And then what we saw is like, okay, you know, from the business side, obviously the intellectual property of all the R&D efforts was not really being effectively, you know, protected. And so from an attacker's perspective, it was very easily to go directly to that data, get access to that, right? And, you know, and that's something that we just always need to have that gut check, you know, that perspective is like, okay, are we looking at the problem the right way? Do we have good visibility? Do we know what we're trying to protect? And then making sure you have the good, you know, effective controls in place to both detect and respond to those things.
Anybody else on the, Bobby, I think you're on mute there.
I'm trying to save us from the dog announcing the Amazon delivery people. So it's interesting because in the course of 3 questions, we've talked about 3 different models, right? So what is that saying? All models are incorrect, but some models are useful. And I think as we think through this question about the Nist CSF, it is a very useful process model. Right. And so thinking about it from a process model construct is really important, which means you have to have a level of depth in each step in the process. And you have to recognize that that process is going to be happening multiple times in your day or in your organization. And so really understanding what you need in each of the steps in that process in order to accomplish that cyber resiliency construct, right? That anticipate, withstand, recover, and adapt under all kinds of circumstances, I think is something that is really important for every organization to do. And then take a step back and say, now, how do I implement this in technology, and what pieces of it do I need to implement in technology so that I have the immutable vault, so that I have the kind of attack warning or threat warning capabilities, so that I understand my environment more holistically. And then you take one further step back and say, now, how do I simplify my environment so that I don't have layer upon layer upon layer of technology creating complexity and additional digital risk that's there. And so all of those are important steps.
Yeah, I'll confess, I spent a lot of time in the recover and ransomware areas, so I see a lot of nails and I have a hammer for them. And Amanda, I'm going to kind of toss a question over to you. If we think about that recover, and I know founders, and you talked about that in your opening comments about it's not if, but when, and that's kind of some of the mentality that you've taken there with the ability to recover. So let me be provocative. Why wouldn't you spend everything that you have to keep the bad actors out and just prevent them from doing any of this bad stuff in the first place?
Oh, I think you got to have a balance, because so many people I see focus on, I've got to have this tool to protect us from this. And you're just constantly adding different tools. But like you say, if you're not using those tools effectively, if you don't understand how they're being used in your environment, that can distract you. So I think recovery has to be, there's importance in each area, and recovery, a lot of times people don't want to put the resources behind that. We're heavy into recovery. We have a recovery dashboard that we're constantly testing our backups. We're testing them at our corporate location, at our co-location, in our vault. We bring business owners in to participate in these testing events. So we put a lot of time and effort into the recovery portion of this model, but I feel like we put a lot into each of these areas. And I think, you've got to decide from a tools and a control standpoint, when is enough, that you've got to trust those controls, but you've got to be prepared when something happens that you aren't expecting. That it could be one click, it could be one misconfiguration that was an accident, and you've got to be prepared when those things happen.
And Paul, you had a little different take on this, which was almost, and I know I'm paraphrasing and maybe being controversial, like it doesn't matter, right? If you do this right, if you have a different take on it, then it almost doesn't matter because the data is valueless to others.
Yeah. I mean, if we do it the right way and we make the data valueless to others, that's where we need to get. But let's if we look at the cybersecurity framework, we could do a really great job with identify, protect, detect, and respond, but none of that matters if we can't get recover right. So imagine a child is kidnapped. We can identify the kidnapping as a problem. We could put protections in place to prevent a kidnapping from occurring. We can detect when a kidnapping occurs, and we can respond by engaging the FBI immediately when we know that an event occurred. And I'm not saying that all of those things are not important. They're all important things for us to do, but we cannot recover the child. If we cannot recover the child, nothing else matters, right? And as a last resort, we may decide that we're going to pay the ransom to get the child back, which only empowers the kidnapper to act again. And so luckily, we live in a world where data is not a child, right? And data is not a physical object. So data could be created and destroyed, right? And we've all learned in our physics class in high school that that's not the case with matter, but it is the case with data. So we can recreate data, we can alter it, we could disguise it, we could turn one copy into a million copies, we can instantly move it around the globe, and we can hide it in plain sight, and we can hide it in the public domain. So we need to stop thinking about data as being a physical object in a physical world, because it isn't. And we need to apply more focus, I think, on how we recover, because everything else is irrelevant if we cannot get that part correctly. And recover means two things. It means having the ability to self-heal when an attack, which is going to happen after that occurs, and making any exfiltrated copies of the data useless to the thief. Those two things I think are important.
There's so much there I'd like to dive in on, about 3 hours worth, I think. So great, but we'll move on. So I kind of left this one pretty open. Most organizations have some type of cloud strategy, and I'm not going to define cloud other than to say, think about it very high level: public cloud, private, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud. How does the way that we approach cyber resilience, does it change when it's in the cloud versus on-prem, when it's, somebody else is controlling that data or owning it? And I didn't tee this up for anybody, so looking for whoever has some interesting thoughts here.
I just gave a real long answer, so I'll just give a real short one with this. I think fundamentally the answer is no. But moving to the cloud introduces a problem that didn't exist before, and that is we're completely entrusting our data to a third party. And while I think we can probably trust Amazon and Microsoft and everybody else out there, we don't really have to, right? If we can make the data useless to everyone, including the cloud provider, by geofragmenting and dispersing the data across multiple providers, the problem completely goes away.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that the real crux of the resilience problem is understanding what business processes are important to you and what data is important to those business processes, and then knowing how you put those two pieces together. And so whether you're putting those two pieces together in compute on your premises, or if you're putting those pieces together because you're dependent on a cloud service provider or an as a service provider, is no different. I mean, it creates complexity in relationships, it creates complexity in some of those areas, but it doesn't change the need to think about resiliency as an important part of your overall strategy.
I completely agree with what Bobby said. And, I think we all can agree that everyone is going into the cloud in some shape or form. And, one of the things that I've, realized, and I've spoken to quite a number of companies on this, there's still the kind of this mindset, especially when we're looking at moving infrastructures from maybe their on-prem into the cloud. There's still this view of, oh, well, we're just migrating this server up into the cloud, right? But it's not that. And really what we're looking at when we talk about IaaS in the cloud, it's these fundamental process changes, right? So we're now embracing DevOps, right? We're talking about horizontal scaling workloads that are completely ephemeral, right? These are deeply, challenging to understand from a security perspective because a lot of those processes have changed. So when we look and we think about this, we really need to understand the processes, because where attackers are more likely to exploit is where that process breaks down, right? So, okay, well, what administrative credentials might be leaked, who has access to what, all of those things is very different than your traditional approach of looking at this from an on-prem perspective. And so that's where you should really be focusing first to understand, okay, how are you set up from a cyber resiliency perspective? Do you have the right security controls in place? Because all of this is just rapidly shifting, and that's even new for the folks that are implementing this, right? So new DevOps teams are coming up, they're learning, they're adapting all the time, and the cybersecurity teams need to kind of fit right in that profile and be embedded with those types of groups.
I think, Tim, one of the really interesting things about your comment is the recursive nature of it, right? We're at this stage where everything is becoming data in some form or another, right? Infrastructure is code, that code is data in some way. And so it isn't of value to the organization when it's sitting. It's only of value to the organization when it's dynamic, when it's being processed and insights are being drawn from it or it's being used. And so we really need to think about our resiliency models to be ones of how that data in action can be protected and how the threats against them can be anticipated.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that all of your answers imply is one that we try to stress with customers too, is it's still your problem. It's still your concern, right? You may be in a cloud, that cloud may be run by somebody else, operated, the security of the cloud versus the security of the data in the cloud. And that's the piece that I think is sometimes missing, the strategy, in my thought, doesn't have to change, but you have to have one. And that's sometimes missing from some of the work that people do in that area. Government. So we've seen a lot more activity, at least I think we've seen a lot more activity out of governments, particularly in the United States, after the critical infrastructure attacks earlier this year. There's always been some, and just want to get some thoughts. And Bob, you know, I'm looking at you. You know, where can government be more effective or be most effective? I've got some customers who, you know, they want the government to do more. So they want the FBI to shut down all the ransomware bad actors. They want the government to fund best practices and standards and things like that, but they don't want the regulation. And of course, those are all tools that can be deployed to help in this area. What's your perspective on kind of what's happening now? And probably focus on the US, but I'm also interested in your thoughts outside of the States.
So what I'll say is what I find today, and essentially it's been this track for the last 10 years, is we're seeing a public debate about what is the role of government in this space. That is an undefined position in this country, and to a large extent, other nations are having the same conversation in their relative, in their ways. And I don't know where it's going to land, right? Every party has a very strong opinion about where they should fall, where that dial should be turned relative to the government in this space. But I am really enjoying watching the dialogue. I remember vividly, I think it would have been a little more than 8 years ago, where the then president used the term cybersecurity in the State of the Union, right? I've been doing security for a really long time. I never imagined that day would happen. And that was, you know, essentially elevating the conversation above technical discussion amongst people about what the right answer is. And so I think the real question that we're debating is, what should that role be? How far should it go? And over whom should it have? Should the government have regulatory power in that space? And how do we understand the existing regulatory power in places where things used to be done physically and are now done digitally? And it's a lovely experience in democracy that I'm really enjoying.
Yeah, interesting. Amanda, I want to get your perspective because you're in one of the most highly regulated industries in the world, the US financial industry. What are your thoughts about government's role there? And has it changed for you over the last maybe 6 to 8 months as these more critical infrastructure attacks have been in the news?
I don't know. That one's a difficult question for me. I know we that ransomware event that we were able to participate in, there was no help. I think they tried to contact the FBI. I mean, it's just, nothing came of that. There was no help there. I think we want the help when we can get it, but we don't, like you said, we don't want them dictating what we do. So I think that's just a difficult line to draw.
Sure. So I've got one more here. So I want to remind the audience, if you've got questions or thoughts, I know there's been a couple things on the chat. I can't monitor it. Larry's in the background helping us. So hopefully we'll get some good things teed up here. But I wanted to end on one that's one of my favorites, and hopefully it's not too dull for everybody else. How does data privacy really factor into this? So you can't really have data privacy without protecting data, but there's so much more to it. Obviously, we've got more complete, stringent laws in Europe with the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, than we do in the States, but we've got things in the States from the individual states that are kind of ramping up and maybe looking down the line to a federal law. Does that factor in at all to this cyber resilience picture? Is it something we should just keep thinking about separately? What are your thoughts or guidance on that? Because I really see these things colliding, and I'm not sure that people agree with me. I'll call on one of you.
I got a quick response. So So, you know, way back in 2006, I testified in front of the Advisory Committee on Federal Rules of Civil Procedure in Washington, D.C., and they were introducing an amendment, and they introduced this term called ESI, electronically stored information, and they said that it should be governed in the jurisdiction in which it is at rest. And that really bothered me, right? So I argued that this was completely ridiculous, that the data should be governed, but it should be governed in the jurisdiction where it's used, not at rest. Kind of what Bobby's saying, where we have to, you know, the data has to be active for it to be of any value to anybody. And I argued in front of the committee that the data could be at rest on the planet Mars one day. And I was not very popular in the room. I lost the argument by a long shot. And of course, the rest of the world followed the United States. And now fast forward to 2021, and we have cloud, we have conflicting regulations, everybody's governing the data where it's at rest, and it's just a complete mess. So I have a vision that one day all data will be contained within what I call a safe data harbor, which is a jurisdiction independent virtual data location that could exist in the cloud. And if the data is jurisdiction independent while at rest, there's no need to worry about it being compliant in any certain state or any certain country. It all just kind of happens automatically. So this completely simplifies compliance. And look, it's a long road ahead for that to happen, but I do have a former regulator that completely agrees with me on the subject. But yeah, I think we kind of got it wrong back in 2006 when we said we're going to govern data by where it's at rest.
I think privacy is one example of the kind of regulations and guidance that gets bound to elements of data. And so your question could be expanded to say, how do we think about health data? How do we think about intellectual property in some instances? How do we think about a whole range of things? And so I think if we truly recognize this future, then we really have to recognize that protection and the protection, transparency, and the use of the data with the integrity of what it was intended to be used for is an important part of our overall future in this digital era.
So with that, we've got a couple of questions here. I think change the order up a little bit. Let's see what we have for questions, and then I'll give everybody a chance if we have time to kind of have some wrap up. So here's one. We speak of cybersecurity live data. What is the position for physical data security? Example, data on retired servers or data that is moved in a decommissioning scenario. So I guess it's interesting, right, Bobby? It's data at rest. It's not being used, to your point, and what Paul followed up on, but it's still there. So what do we do about that? That's a good question. This is why it's good to be moderator. I just ask the questions. You don't have to actually.
I mean, I think data represents a target. And so Paul's comment about how do we reduce or sometimes remove the attack surface, it exists in each of these instances. And really the value of something like a converged security program lets you think about physical security and cybersecurity in sort of this integrated sense. And so knowing where your data is an obligation of all data owners. And knowing that you're about to decommission a server, what's on it, and how you need to handle that in an appropriate way, I think is the obligation of mature IT organizations.
Yeah, and just adding in, I mean, this is actually pretty related to the previous topic, right? And I think one of the big challenges that we have with all these different regulations, one is actually understanding like what we actually need to do, which is the letter of the law versus where the enforcement is going to happen. But more importantly, right, we even have a lot of different regulations that conflict with each other, right? So some have like, oh, you need to retain data for X amount of time. Other is, oh, you can't hold on to data. And so where this plays into cyber resiliency is really important, right? Because you don't want to be stuck in this reactionary mode of like, oh, okay, well, how do we protect all this data that we now have to, to house and hold on to for a really long time? And so you really need to think about this kind of going in, both like, okay, how do you make sure that, you know, the authorization of who can access that data has the right controls around this? And, you know, and then there's other things, obviously, you know, like encrypting the data and making sure that you have, you know, kind of tying back to what Paul was saying, you know, as kind of looking at this, and it's like, okay, well, what happens if this data is, you know, compromised or exposed? How do you actually recover from that? So, you know, and then a lot of these things, both from the legal aspect and regulations, are, you know, they're going to change, you know, very frequently, and making sure you are thinking about those as you're building your programs to be able to respond to that is really important.
And Tim, I completely agree with that. What's so complex for the enterprise is you have this decommissioned server, and if you just literally physically put it on a train and move it to the other side of the mountain range, it could be completely illegal to have that data there, right? So it's silly to think about how we manage data with borders. It's just silly to me. But yeah, I agree with what you said, Tim.
Well, kind of related to that, another question came in. How do you feel about data sprawl and the abundance of backup or archive data? I think that's a pretty wide open question. I mean, that could apply to privacy, could apply to cybersecurity, could apply to AI misusing data, ethics, things like that. But any thoughts about just generally data sprawl and how much data we have stored in backups and archives? I guess if you put a resilience window on that, we have an obligation to be resilient for that data, or maybe a little bit freer. I don't know.
I think what's important there is being able to show that it's being able to identify your data, what's stale, what's not, because a lot of times people don't want to get rid of it. And it just grows and grows, and it's just a dumping ground, and they don't understand that it opens up us for risk. And really just being able to understand how that data is being used and being able to share that information with the business. Because if you can prove to them this data hasn't been accessed in this amount of time, it's not being used, do you want to accept that risk or just remove it? I think just being able to identify that and being able to share that with the business so they can make decisions on that, because that's a big problem. If you don't, it's just going to continue to grow and be a dumping ground.
That's a really good perspective. You know, part of my practice is the compliance, and it's been much more focused on cybersecurity. But you know, we've seen time and again that it really takes almost no authority to collect and save data, but you need a whole bunch of different signatures to get rid of it. And that's even worse once it hits an archive that might have implications for the legal department. You know, lawyers don't get paid to delete data. There's not a whole lot of upward mobility for that, unfortunately. But if you delete something that should have been saved, and Paul, it goes back to your 2006 testimony with ESI, there's a lot of trouble to be had there. So it's a complex environment. Hopefully we get better at that over time.
I think if it was inexpensive to keep all of this backup data in the sprawl, I think it was inexpensive and we were able to de-risk it, I think that's what the enterprise would want, right? So there is no risk about deleting something that might be on litigation hold or something that they have for the under regulation regulatory requirement to retain. If they could keep all the data and it was inexpensive to store that, and it was impossible for someone to breach or exfiltrate that data, and there was no risk, then I think the enterprise would want to keep it.
Yeah, I think they want to keep it even with the risk. They just think they might need it down the line. And of course there is risk with it. And I know where you're going with that in terms of being able to de-risk it and things like that. So it's an interesting lot of possibilities for the future. So we don't have other questions out here. First, I want to thank all of you and give you a minute to think about this if we want to have a minute or two wrap up to kind of close out. And I hesitate to call on anybody. You guys have been very good and patient with me. If anybody wants to volunteer to go first, any final thoughts about our panel today?
I think the really important thing that you've heard over and over and over again is to invest time in understanding yourself, invest time in building your team before a crisis occurs, invest time in building your run books and knowledge about how you'll respond when that happens, and then adapt each time that you need to, and then ensure that the technology that you have in place is the right technology for you and supports all of those things.
Good thoughts.
Yeah. Well said.
I would add in, it's there's always a million things to cover when it comes to cybersecurity, and you have that infinite list of, okay, here's all of our gaps and here's what we need to do, and you only have finite amount of resources. It's always important just to take a look at this from a risk perspective, right? And different companies are going to have different risk profiles and understanding what they need to focus on first, whether it's external actors, whether it's potential insider threats. And once you really look at it from that perspective, it really helps just kind of bring it to ground, like, okay, we can focus on these things first and start chipping away at that infinite list, and your cybersecurity profile is going to be much better. And it really starts with having visibility, right? And that's something that I just, I try to hammer into everyone all the time, right? You have to understand what is going on in the environment, who has access to what systems, who's actively using things, what is usual versus unusual. That gives you that baseline profile so you know where to prioritize things.
I would add on to that, I mean, cybersecurity has come a long way, right? But we all know it's far from perfect. And I think we need to stop thinking about data as being a physical object. I think that's kind of where we've been hung up for the last couple of decades. And we cannot protect it by placing it inside a strong fortress. It doesn't work that way. I think we need to devalue the data and make it useless to everyone in the world except for the rightful owner of that data. And many companies are really working very hard on these problems, because these problems definitely need to be solved, right? I mean, I think we're on the cusp of really a paradigm shift and some extraordinary changes. I think my research into the industry, there's a lot of companies, and I think data protection is about to improve really by an order of magnitude, at least by an order of magnitude in the very short term. So there's a lot of attention on this right now. The whole world is trying to fix this problem.
Amanda, we started with you, and any final thoughts here to close us out before we give it back to Yvonne?
No, I think, a lot of times I get asked the question, well, how many resources do you have toward that? How many people do you have on your recovery team? How many, and a lot of times I don't know if people they don't have the resources or they don't want to fund it, but it's not an option today. You have to.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, resource constraints, budget constraints, but you have to look at it in the big picture. This is what a lot of organizations are about now. If we're not protecting the data, we're not protecting our business. So I want to thank my great panel. Thanks for putting up with me today, bouncing around here. I thought it was a really good discussion. Thank you to all the attendees, to ACG Silicon Valley for the opportunity, Yvonne. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, we loved having everyone on today, and I see there's a couple more questions. And Dennis, if you would like to connect with any of the panelists and have that question answered, be happy to do so. And thank you, just what Jim said. Thank you to everyone attending. Thank you to our fantastic panel. I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did as well. Join us again for another ACG Silicon Valley event, and have a fantastic week, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Amanda.
Bye.
Sorry, Amanda, may I connect with you after the meeting?